So what's the politics of money that come out of this? Go back to the 1970s. As was mentioned in the introduction by the principal, the 1970s was an interesting period. Many of us lived through it. I was a youngster in those days, but I still remember the 3-day week. I remember candles, I remember the strikes, I remember out-of-control Labour, I remember the election of Margaret Thatcher, I remember all the good music from the 1980s, all that sort of great stuff, right? It was a terrible decade, it was completely untenable, we had to change everything. There is no alternative. Remember that one? That's the deal? Right. Here's a weird thing, if you go back and look at it. You had positive inflation. You had relatively moderate to high inflation. It's quite interesting. Labour's share of national income in the 1970s was at an all-time high. Interesting. We, Labour, took home more of national income than we'd ever done in history. Corporate profits right throughout the West were at an all-time low. Unions were very strong. Inequality was low. Finance was weak. It was still in its post-Bretton Woods box. Central banks were weak. They were check-cashing agencies for the Treasury. And parliaments were strong and politics was national. Then that thing that couldn't hold, you know, there is an alternative way to change all that. What did we do? We changed it all. So you have the whole neoliberal revolution. And what do you end up with? Secular disinflation. Basically, ruthless product market integration and deregulation meant that prices for stuff has fallen dramatically. This is actually very interesting because it's one of the reasons that wages have stagnated, because basically I don't need to give you a real wage increase if prices keep falling. It's the Walmart effect. So long as prices get cheaper, your real wage is actually going up, or at least it looks like that, so long as you can pull that trick off. Capital share of income is at an all-time high. Thank you, Thomas Piketty, for reminding us of this. Labour's, reciprocally, is at a low point. We've never taken home less. Wages have stagnated. Unions are weak everywhere. Markets have globalized, which means price effects are amplified through the system. Finance has never been stronger. Central banks have never been stronger. And parliaments are weak. As you know, they spend most of their time talking bullshit about immigration and basically tweeting to each other. Which is true. I mean, really, they are useless. Now, segue for a minute. What is money? If you do a basic econ course, I'll tell you these 3 things. It's a means of exchange. Yeah, something has to be the numerator, something has to denominate everything else. It's a unit of account. It's very useful for counting stuff, right? And it's a store of value. Now, a friend of mine that I write with is a guy called Eric Lonergan, who's a hedge fund manager. Oh, yes, I have friends who are hedge fund managers. They're not all bastards. And he defines actually money as a hedge against uncertainty. It's a lovely way of thinking about it, because why do we value cash? Because we don't know what tomorrow will bring, and therefore if you have something that you can save, which you can then exercise an option on, it gives you optionality over the future, then it's a wonderful device. It allows intergenerational credit and transfers, and it's a fantastic thing. Money's awesome, right? But the problem is, if you don't know what the future's going to bring, the question is, will the paper be worth anything when we get there? The traditional problem of inflation and so on and so forth. But just think of this as a kind of an uncertainty problem. You don't know if the money is going to be worth it when you get there, so what's the point in saving the money? Now, let's switch back to the politics for a minute. Social scientists who study sort of politics often talk about collective action. So what's the insight here? Have you ever gone out to dinner with 12 people and tried to pay the bill in a restaurant? You're immediately aware of the politics of collective action, because somebody will be a free rider, right? They will try and hide, right? They're usually the person that's had the 4 extra gin and tonics as well, right? So, you know, there's that problem. Then there's the coordination problem involved in it. Just basically, oh, who had the lasagna, you know, all that sort of shit, right? But basically, what it means is in large groups, the optimal contribution of effort of any individual declines as a function of the marginal benefit you get from it. So it makes sense for everybody to wait for somebody else to do it, right? Now, this is a wonderfully robust, powerful theory, but it also runs up against some obvious things like facts, because people do act collectively, they do act purposefully. You just went through 2 years of referendum debate, which was all about collective action, so obviously this stuff happens. What I want to suggest is the politics in the 1970s, which took place under a period of inflation, produced a very different politics from what we've got just now, which is a period of deflation. So let me walk you through this. In 1943, there was a guy called Mikhail Kalecki, and he wrote a wonderful article. It's 7 pages long in Political Quarterly, and it's called The Political Aspects of Full Employment. And he pointed out a problem with the Keynesian revolution that was about to be unleashed on the world. And he says, imagine that you can't actually get full employment all the time. What's that going to do? It's going to squeeze corporate profits, because wages will be able to go up and up and up, because the costs of changing a job will decline to 0. So basically, you will end up screwing capital, and then they will go on an investment strike. They will refuse to invest, and then you're going to have huge economic problems. My goodness, was that man prescient, because that was pretty much what happened in the 1970s. So what happens here, in an inflationary period, particularly if you're talking about people who own paper assets, you're taking money from them. Inflation is a class-specific tax or an asset-specific tax. Because if I'm sitting with an interest-bearing instrument that pays 4% and inflation's now 5%, I've just lost. Now people say, oh, but inflation hurts the poor the most and all that. You know, the only people who ever make that argument are rich people with lots of paper assets. Because the poor can get redress through governments. Pensioners can get redress because they vote. Right? Try cutting pensions and see how far you get. That's not going to work too well, is it? So in that case, it's capital's interest that get put on the chopping block. So they mobilize, they get organized, and basically you have the Thatcher and Reagan revolutions. Capital's interests are clear in an inflation. Labour is on the defensive, but is increasingly fragmented. Technology changes in geography where stuff is made. Remember the whole decline of the traditional industries here on the Clydeside, right? The neoliberal offensive takes place at the level of ideas and institutions. There is no alternative. We need to have an independent central bank. Inflation's more important than unemployment. You can't really do anything about long-run growth through government intervention, etc., right? The state is weakened and finance is ascendant. And this is why Reagan and Thatcher and Blair and Cameron are all of one colour and one cloth. But when you're in a disinflationary period, you get what I call Polanyi's revenge. And what's that? There's a fallacy of composition at the level of interest formation. What on earth does that mean? Imagine the following. You're in a deflation, prices are going down. If you're a businessman, you don't know if that's a local event specific to you or a global event. And if you did know it was a global event, it's not going to do you any good because there's nothing you can do about it. So what do you do if you don't want to go out of business when people aren't buying as much? You have a sale. So if you have a sale, what happens to everybody else? They have a sale too. What have you just done? You've all just pushed down the price level and made it worse. What happens if you're Labour and you're like, oh, there's unemployment? We go, well, I'll work for less. I'll price myself into a job. I'll get on my Norman Tebbit bike and go off and I'll price myself into a job. Well, individually rational, collectively disastrous, because what happens if everybody tries to price themselves into a job? Consumption collapses and you end up with more unemployment. So there's a really different politics because your first best effort to make yourself better off produces second best outcomes for everybody. So whereas in this world, basically, capital's interests are clear. Here, they're not so clear because everybody's getting screwed. And that's the politics of deflation. In such periods, what you get are anti-creditor coalitions led by the state. It's not the capitalist taking over the state to rewrite the rules to be capital friendly. That was the 70s. It's now. And what does now look like? Creditor-debtor standoffs at the level of the state, domestic austerity, and internationally, the Eurozone crisis. And what do you get as a reply? The Front National, Podemos, Syriza, the SNP, Sinn Féin, all anti-austerity. They may have different flavours, some of them may be nationalistic and xenophobic, some may be cosmopolitan and liberal, but ultimately they're coming up against the same thing. So we live in a very, very interesting period politically. This is the politics of money we're dealing with.